One soldier, 14 armed men, and a radio that crackled with contempt. Send her out. We will be gentle. Below the ridge, they moved like men who had already won. Weapons loose, shoulders easy, the casual arrogance of numbers. They had no idea she was already in position. They had no idea she had been counting them for 20 minutes. They had no idea that the woman they were laughing about had just made a decision that would define the rest of their afternoon and the rest of her life. She pressed her cheek against the rifle stock, exhaled, and went to work. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow Maya's story all the way to the end, because what happens next changed everyone who witnessed it. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. She had sent the message at 4:47 in the afternoon. That detail mattered to her later, when she tried to remember everything in order. When the Army investigators came with their clipboards and their quiet eyes and their carefully worded questions, Maya Carter could recall the exact time she keyed the radio, the exact words she used, and the exact sound of the response that came back. She remembered all of it, the way soldiers remember things that almost killed them. Not with clarity, with weight. The radio in her hand was barely functional. The explosion that had destroyed the observation point 40 minutes earlier had done significant damage to the housing, cracked the casing on the left side, and damaged the frequency selector in a way that made it drift unpredictably between two channels. She had to hold the unit at a specific angle, 3 fingers pressed against the cracked seam, to keep the signal from cutting out entirely. It was with that broken radio, held at that careful angle, her right hand trembling slightly from the gash across her palm, that Maya Carter spoke her final warning. Last warning, turn back. I'm recon trained. She had kept her voice flat, professional. She had not raised it or lowered it. She had not added a threat. She had not explained what she was capable of or described what recon training actually meant on practical terms, because she had always believed that the clearest words were the most powerful ones. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then came the laughter. It started with one voice and spread quickly to overlapping, the kind of group laughter that feeds on itself. Someone in the background said something she couldn't fully translate, but the tone needed no translation. Another voice called out something in a language she recognized but couldn't perfectly follow, and that set off another wave of noise. Then the first voice came back on, steadier now, with the particular confidence of a man who has decided he is in control of a situation. Send her out. We will be gentle. She took the radio away from her ear. She set it down beside her left knee, careful to keep the cracked side up. She picked up her rifle, and then Maya Carter got to work. She had been on the ridge for 6 hours before the explosion changed everything. The original mission had been straightforward in the way that missions always are on paper and never are in reality. Her unit had received intelligence about an abandoned observation point in the Arizona high desert, a location that had been used by a U.S. reconnaissance team during training operations 3 years earlier and then quietly forgotten. The intelligence suggested the locations still contained equipment worth recovering, specifically 2 hardened communications units that had been cached there when the team had to extract quickly. Maya had been assigned the recovery because she knew the terrain. She had trained in that region during her 2nd year of service, had spent 11 days learning the specific way the desert light played tricks on distance and the particular sounds the ridgeline made when the wind shifted after sunset. Her support team was supposed to be 40 minutes behind her. They weren't. A vehicle problem on the mountain road, a broken axle on a hard turn, had left them stranded 12 miles back. They radioed her at 3:15 to explain. Their secondary vehicle was coming, but the timeline had changed. She would need to sit and wait. She told them she understood. She told them she would hold her position. She did not tell them what she had already seen through her scope, because she was still processing it herself, still counting, still making sure she was reading the situation correctly before she said anything that would sound alarming. 14 men, moving in a pattern that was not random, carrying weapons that were not hunting rifles, heading directly toward the forgotten settlement at the base of the valley, where, she had confirmed 40 minutes earlier, there were 6 wounded American personnel waiting inside the old medical station for a medical evacuation that had been delayed by weather. 6 people who could not run. 6 people who did not know what was coming. She had not caused it. That was the first thing she wanted to make clear later. The old observation point had been abandoned for 3 years, and abandoned military positions in remote desert terrain carry risks that have nothing to do with the people who come after. Old materials, Old pressures, old mistakes left behind by people who didn't think they'd matter. It mattered. The blast was not enormous, but it was enough. It collapsed the front wall of the position, drove a piece of concrete casing into her left shoulder, threw her 3 feet to her right, and left her ears ringing for nearly 20 minutes afterward. She also caught a piece of debris across her right palm, not deep enough to threaten the hand, but deep enough to make everything she did with it for the next several hours a conscious decision. She lay still for 60 seconds after the blast. This was training. When an explosion happens and you are still conscious, you lie still and take inventory before you move. You identify your location. You identify your injuries. You assess your equipment. You do not panic. You do not rush. She identified her location. She was inside the collapsed position, partially sheltered by the remaining walls. She identified her injuries: left shoulder, significant impact, likely deep bruising or a minor fracture of the collarbone area. She couldn't be certain without movement she didn't want to make yet. Right palm, bleeding but controlled. Both ears ringing but functional. She assessed her equipment: rifle intact, ammunition intact, radio damaged, secondary pistol intact, water 1 partial bottle, medical supplies basic. Then she heard voices from below. The explosion had removed the one advantage she'd been counting on: concealment. The blast had sent a visible column of dust and debris into the air. Whatever had been invisible about her position 60 seconds earlier was no longer invisible. She watched through the scope as several of the men below stopped moving and turned toward the ridge. She watched one of them raise something: binoculars. She determined and scanned in her direction. She pressed herself flat and did not move. For 11 minutes she did not move. And during those 11 minutes, lying on broken concrete with a bleeding hand and a shoulder that was beginning to tell her very clearly how unhappy it was, Maya Carter listened to the voices below grow louder and listened to the direction of movement shift toward the settlement. And she made her decision. She was not going to retreat. She was going to stay. The radio conversation with her support team, which came in fragments over the next 20 minutes because of the damaged receiver, went like this. Her first transmission: position compromised. Explosion at the OP. I am functional. 6 friendlies in the Valley Medical Station. 14 hostiles approaching. I need a timeline. Support team response: partial broken. Vehicle ETA now 90. Weather complication on the medevac. Advise you fall back to secondary. Her second transmission: I cannot fall back. Hostiles will reach the station before any support arrives. 6 friendlies cannot move. I am holding. A longer silence than the transmission lag could explain. Then a different voice, one she recognized as Sergeant Torres, her unit's senior NCO, who was with the support team 12 miles away at a broken axle on a mountain road. Carter, that is 14 armed individuals. Say again the count. 14. Another pause. Carter, you are one person. I know what I am, Sergeant. Silence your call, he said finally. We are moving as fast as we can. Whatever you do up there, do it smart. Copy that. She set the radio down. She took 3 slow breaths. And then she sent the warning to the 14 men below, because she had always believed that you give people a chance to make the right choice before you remove the choice entirely. They laughed, so she went to work. The first thing Maya did was reposition. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Moving from a compromised position while injured, on a ridgeline, in fading afternoon light, without making noise or creating movement that could be tracked from below, was a specific kind of difficult that most people do not have a framework to understand. Every piece of gravel was a potential sound. Every shift of weight was a potential silhouette. She moved 17 meters to her left along the ridge over the course of 14 minutes. 14 minutes for 17 meters. She counted every second. She did this because her training had taught her something that took years to genuinely internalize. The person who controls the pace of a confrontation controls the confrontation. If she was rushed, she would make noise. If she made noise, she would be located. If she was located, the 6 people in the valley had nobody. So she moved slowly. When she settled into the new position, she had a different angle on the settlement below and a clearer view of the approach path the 14 men were using. She spent 4 minutes simply watching, studying. The same way she had studied every training environment she'd ever been placed in, every scenario, every exercise where an instructor had told her that observation was 90% of the job. She watched how they moved. She identified 3 distinct patterns. The first group moved quickly and with confidence. These were the aggressive elements, the ones most likely to push forward into unknown situations. There were 5 of them, clustered near the front of the formation. The second group moved methodically. These were the tactically experienced members, spacing themselves, watching their angles. There were 4 of them, and they were the ones she watched most carefully. The third group moved cautiously, staying back, staying together. These were the communications and support elements. She identified the radio operator by the distinct outline of the equipment on his back. She noted all of this. She did not hurry. At approximately 5:15 in the afternoon, the formation below began to change direction. The lead elements, the 5 aggressive fighters at the front, had nearly reached the outer edge of the settlement. They were moving toward the medical station with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. Their body language was unmistakable even at distance. The looseness in their shoulders, the casual way they held their weapons, the occasional gesture of one to another that seemed almost like ordinary conversation. They believed they were dealing with a frightened, injured soldier with nowhere to go. They had not been told yet that the explosion on the ridge hadn't trapped her. It had simply moved her. The first true confrontation of the afternoon began not with a shot, but with a sound. Maya had learned in training exercises that she had at the time thought were unnecessarily elaborate, how to use audio displacement in open terrain. Sound in desert environments with irregular rock formations bounces in ways that are counterintuitive. A sharp crack in one location appears to originate from another. 2 sounds in rapid succession can create a perceptual effect that makes a person believe they are being surrounded. This was not magic, this was physics, and she used it. The sound she created, a deliberate, controlled noise against the rock formation to her right, sent 4 of the 5 forward fighters breaking left in response. They moved fast, weapons up, angles changed, covering a position that had nothing in it. The formation broke. Not permanently, not decisively. But it broke in a way that mattered. Because the 4 experienced fighters in the middle group stopped immediately when they saw the forward group react, and they did not move toward the medical station while they were assessing what had happened to the forward group's formation. 30 seconds. That was what she bought. 30 seconds of confusion. But in a situation where the difference between survival and failure could be measured in minutes, 30 seconds was not nothing. The voice came back on the radio she'd left partially open. It was not the same voice as before. This one was harder, lower. It carried the specific quality of someone who was not laughing anymore. Soldier, I know you are on the ridge. I know you are alone. My men are going to reach that building regardless of what you do. The only question is whether you make it worse for yourself first. She did not respond, he continued. You sent a warning. I respect that. Now I am stand down. Show yourself. We will not harm the personnel inside if you cooperate. She pressed her cheek against the stock, exhaled. He was lying. She knew he was lying the same way. She knew the difference between a desert mirage and water. It was not logical analysis. It was accumulated experience in understanding what people sound like when they are telling the truth and what they sound like when they are reciting a line they believe will produce a useful result. He did not sound like a man offering terms. He sounded like a man buying time. She understood because she was doing exactly the same thing. You've got about 4 minutes, she said quietly. Into the radio, just loud enough to be heard. 4 minutes for what? To decide if you actually want what's behind that door. Silence. Then you are one person. You keep saying that, she said. I keep not leaving. She clicked the radio off. The next 40 minutes were the hardest 40 minutes of her life. She would say this later, without hesitation or qualification, when asked to describe the timeline. Not the most dangerous, though they were that. Not the most painful, though the shoulder was communicating its displeasure in increasingly specific terms. The hardest, because every decision she made in those 40 minutes required her to hold 2 things in her mind simultaneously, what was true and what she needed the men below to believe was true. She moved 3 more times. Each movement was deliberate. Each was designed to create a different impression of where she was and how many options she had. She had learned in a training exercise she remembered now with a clarity that surprised her. A cold morning in a Georgia training facility with a sergeant who spoke entirely in quiet declarative sentences that an opponent's imagination is always more dangerous than your actual position. Keep them unsure. If they are unsure, they hesitate. If they hesitate, the wounded people in that building have more time. She moved, she observed, she waited, and she talked. Not to herself. She was not the kind of person who talked to herself in difficult situations. She talked to the 6 people inside the medical station who could not hear her, who did not know she was there, who had no idea that someone on the ridge was doing math they would never be able to fully explain. Hold on, she said quietly. to no one who could hear her. Help is coming. You just have to hold on. It was not strategy. It was not training. It was simply the only honest thing she had left to say. At 5:58 in the afternoon, the man with the lower, harder voice made a decision. She watched it happen through the scope. She watched him turn to the experienced middle group, saw the body language of instruction passing between them, saw 3 of the 4 methodical fighters begin to move with new purpose. He had decided that waiting was no longer acceptable. He was going to push through. She had approximately 90 seconds before the first element reached the door of the medical station. She thought about the 6 people inside. She thought about the radio 12 miles away with Sergeant Torres on the other end of it, moving as fast as a broken axle allowed. She thought about the training sergeant in Georgia who had stood at a whiteboard and said, in his quiet declarative way, that the most powerful thing a recon specialist could do was control what the enemy was looking at. She made her decision, and the next 90 seconds changed everything. When the dust settled and the valley went quiet for the first time in nearly 2 hours, Maya Carter was still on the ridge. Her shoulder hurt in a way that had become its own separate presence, like another person she was responsible for managing. Her right hand had stopped bleeding, but had also become significantly less cooperative with the fine motor demands she was placing on it. She had consumed the last of her water 40 minutes earlier. She was exhausted in a way that went past tired and became something closer to a fundamental physical negotiation with her own body, where every continued action required a separate, deliberate permission from the parts of her that simply wanted to stop. But she was still on the ridge, and the 6 people in the medical station below were still alive. She picked up the radio. "Torres," she said. "Carter." His voice came back immediately, which told her he had been holding it. "C-Trep, Valley is quiet. I'm holding. Where are you?" 8 minutes out, medevac is 10, Carter, a pause. How many? She understood the question. "All 6, she said. "They're all still there." She heard something on the other end of the radio that she chose not to identify specifically because Sergeant Torres was a professional, and professionals did not make those kinds of sounds in the field. But she heard it, and she understood it, and she held the radio against her chest for a moment before she brought it back to her ear. "Carter," he said. "Recovered now. Professional again. What's your status?" "Functional," she said, which was true, technically, if you defined functional generously. "We're coming," he said. "I know." She said, "I'll be here." She set the radio down. She picked up her rifle. She watched the valley. She waited. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a sustained confrontation in open terrain, and it is nothing like peace. Peace is an arrival. This was a held breath. This was the valley itself deciding whether it was finished with the afternoon or whether it had more to say. Maya knew it wasn't over. She knew it because 14 men do not simply stop. She knew it because the man with the lower, harder voice had not spoken again. And silence from a person who has been very certain himself is not the silence of surrender. It is the silence of revision. He was changing the plan. She could feel it the way she could feel the change in desert wind before the temperature dropped. A physical certainty that arrived before she could articulate the evidence for it. She tightened her grip on the rifle. She breathed. She scanned the ridge below and to her left, then right, then back to the settlement, then up the opposite slope. And there, on the edge of her vision, moving through the shadows at the far end of the valley wall, was a single figure, moving upward, moving toward the ridge, moving toward her. The hunter had decided to stop hunting the building. He was hunting her instead. She looked at the figure through the scope and understood, with absolute clarity, that the next chapter of this afternoon was going to be nothing like the first one. Because what had just changed was this. Until this moment, she had been in control of what he was looking at. Now he knew exactly where she was. The rifle felt heavier than it had all afternoon. She exhaled. She did not let fear make the decision. She calculated. She waited. And somewhere 8 minutes away, on a mountain road where a broken axle was finally being resolved, Sergeant Torres was driving as fast as the terrain allowed, holding his own radio, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say except faster. Faster. The ridge was quiet. The valley was quiet. And Maya Carter, who had sent a warning that nobody believed, who had held a line that everyone said could not be held, who had stayed when every sensible calculation said to go. Maya Carter watched the figure move upward through the shadows, and she made herself slow her breathing. She made herself think clearly, and she made herself remember what the sergeant in Georgia had written at the bottom of the whiteboard on the last day of the training exercise. She had read it so many times it was no longer a sentence. It was simply the truth. The mission is not over until the last person is safe. She settled in. She was not going anywhere. The figure was still moving. Maya tracked him through the scope with the kind of focused stillness that her body had learned to produce under pressure, not calm exactly, but a narrowing, a compression of everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. Heartbeat, breath, crosshair distance. He was moving carefully. That told her something important immediately. The men who had moved carelessly earlier in the afternoon had been the ones who were confident. This man was not moving carelessly. He was using the natural contours of the valley wall, stepping into shadows before crossing open ground, pausing at regular intervals to listen. He had done this before. She adjusted her angle slightly. He stopped. For 3 full seconds he stood completely still, and Maya felt something she hadn't felt since the explosion that afternoon, genuine uncertainty about whether she had been seen. She did not move. She controlled her breathing with the mechanical precision of someone who had practiced this specific skill until it became involuntary. Outhold. The crosshair did not waver. He moved again. She let out the breath she'd been holding and allowed herself one single moment of relief before she put it away and got back to work. Relief was a luxury. She could afford it later when Torres was in the valley and the medevac had the 6 wounded personnel on board, and the only thing left to manage was her own broken shoulder and bleeding hand. Not yet, not even close to yet. She keyed the radio. Torres, single hostile, moving up the east ridge toward my position. Moving smart. He knows roughly where I am. Torres responded within 2 seconds. Can you relocate? Not without giving him audio confirmation of my position. A beat. How long can you hold where you are? She looked at the figure below, calculated his pace against the terrain, estimated the remaining distance. 12 minutes before he's at my elevation. Maybe less if he finds a faster line. We're 6 minutes out, Torres said. Carter, 6 minutes. Copy. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that 6 minutes and 12 minutes were not the same number, and the gap between them was going to require a decision she hadn't fully made yet. She watched the figure move. He was maybe 230 meters below her now, angling across a section of exposed rock that gave him no cover but shortened his route. She watched him cross it quickly, hunched low, moving with an urgency that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. He was speeding up, which meant he had either received information or he had made an inference, or both. She thought about what information he could have received, and the answer arrived immediately and unpleasantly: the radio. She had been transmitting. If he had a receiver tuned to the right frequency, and if he was the kind of careful, experienced operator his movement suggested he was, then he absolutely had a receiver he could have triangulated her general position from the signal alone. Not precisely, but well enough to narrow the ridge down to a manageable search area. She had been talking herself into a target. Torres, she said. He may have my frequency. Minimize transmissions. Understood. 4 minutes, Carter. Copy. She put the radio down and thought hard for about 15 seconds, which was all the time she had. The standard recon response to a compromised position: simple. Move. Create a new position, re-establish advantage, force the pursuer to start his search over from a broader baseline. Every training scenario she'd ever run had reinforced this. You did not stay in a compromised position, you moved. But moving meant sound, and sound meant confirmation. And confirmation meant he would stop searching and start closing, fast, and 4 minutes was an entirely different calculation if he had a confirmed location versus a probable one. She stayed. It was the harder choice by a significant margin. Staying meant accepting that he might find her. Staying meant trusting that his search pattern, without audio confirmation, would take long enough to matter. Staying meant sitting on a ridge with a compromised shoulder and a hand that was becoming less reliable by the minute, holding completely still while a trained man moved upward through the shadows, specifically looking for her. She stayed, and she watched. He had closed to approximately 180 meters and had slowed again, which told her the urgency that had driven the faster pace had either been spent or replaced by caution. He was entering the zone where the terrain became unpredictable, where the ridge fractured into a series of irregular steps and channels that were difficult to navigate quickly without making noise. She knew this section of the ridge. She had moved through it herself, twice, during her repositioning earlier in the afternoon. She knew exactly which surfaces held and which ones shifted. She knew where the gravel was deep enough to crunch, and where the solid rock underneath it gave a quieter purchase. He didn't know any of that, and that, she thought, was a specific advantage worth something. She heard him before she saw him change direction, a single sharp shift of displaced rock, somewhere in the fractured section below. The kind of sound that stops your heart for a half second before your brain catches up and identifies it, and she watched him freeze immediately when he heard it himself. He knew the sound had carried. He knew whoever was above him had heard it too. He did not move for 90 seconds. She did not move for 90 seconds. Two trained people on the same ridge, in the same fading light, both holding still, both thinking. Then he did something she had not expected. He spoke, not into a radio, directly into the air, toward the ridge above him, in accented but clear English. "You are still up there," he said. It was not a question. "I can feel it." She said nothing. "I am not here for the people in the building. That part is done." A pause. "I am here for you specifically." She stayed silent. "My name is not important," he continued. And she noticed he had stopped moving entirely while he talked, using the conversation itself as a kind of stillness, a held moment. "What is important is that I have been doing this for 16 years. And in 16 years, I have never encountered a single person on a ridge who held position under these conditions." She kept her breathing controlled. "I want to understand," he said. And there was something in his voice that she couldn't immediately categorize, not admiration exactly, not respect in the conventional sense, but something close to genuine professional curiosity. "What are you holding for? The people in that building don't know you exist. They cannot see you. They will never know what you did up here today." He waited. She said nothing. "That is the part I cannot understand," he said. She thought about answering. She turned the words over in her mind, considered whether engaging was a tactical liability or a tactical opportunity, and decided in about 4 seconds that it was both, and that the opportunity was the one worth pursuing. "You don't have to understand it," she said. "You just have to stop." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. "There she is," he said quietly, almost himself. And then louder, "You know I have your position now. You had it before," she said. "You just couldn't confirm it." Another pause. "That is true, and you still haven't moved." "No," he said, "I have not." "Why?" This was the one who didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone who was also choosing words deliberately. "Because I have been doing this for 16 years, and I know what a prepared position looks like. And I know what an unprepared position looks like. And I cannot yet determine which one you are in." "That's a smart reason," she said. "It is the only reason that keeps a man alive after 16 years, he said. She shifted her weight slightly. The shoulder sent protest that she acknowledged and set aside. Her hand tightened on the rifle, and she registered the reduced responsiveness in her fingers, filed it, compensated for it, mentally. Torres was 2 minutes out, maybe less. She needed to keep this man talking or keep this man still for 2 more minutes. Those were not the same objective, and she ran both calculations simultaneously. If he was talking, he was not moving. If he was not moving, he was not closing. If he was not closing, he was not in a position to create a crisis in the final 2 minutes before Torres arrived. That was the talking calculation, and it was favorable. But talking also told him things. Every exchange confirmed her position more precisely. Every response she gave was data he was using to build a more accurate picture of where she was on the ridge, what angle she was working from, how much she could see, and how much she couldn't. That was the risk calculation, and it was less favorable. She chose to keep talking, because Torres was 2 minutes out, and 2 minutes was a number she could work with. 16 years, she said. That's a long time to choose this. Yes, he said simply. Did you ever want something different? A long pause. Long enough that she wondered if he was going to answer at all. Long enough that she tracked his outline through the scope and confirmed he hadn't moved. Once, he said finally, when I was much younger. What happened? The same thing that happens to everyone who wants something different, he said. The world did not cooperate. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It is not a beat. You are trying to keep me talking. Yes, she said. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a breath that fell somewhere between them. And I am letting you, because I am also trying to keep you talking. I know, she said. Then we understand each other. We do. This does not have to end badly, he said. And this time the professional curiosity in his voice had shifted into something that sounded improbably, almost like genuine concern. Stand down. Show yourself. Whatever support you have called is coming regardless. You have done what you came to do. The people in the building are safe. You can stop now. She felt the pull of it. She recognized the pull for exactly what it was, not truth, but a very good approximation of truth, wrapped around a specific false assumption, and she identified the false assumption and set the pull aside. The false assumption was that she had done everything she needed to do. She hadn't. Torres was still 100 meters from the valley floor. The medevac was still 4 minutes out. The other 13 men, however scattered, however uncertain, were still in the area of the settlement. 6 people were still in a building waiting for an extraction that had not yet arrived. She had not done what she came to do. She had done most of it. "I'm not done," she said. He moved. The conversation had run its course and they both knew it, and the figure below abandoned the careful stillness of the talking and resumed climbing with a new urgency that had nothing conversational about it. He had decided. Whatever calculation he'd been running had resolved itself, and the result was forward. Maya tracked him through the scope. 90 meters. 80. She heard the radio crackle. Carter. Close now. She could hear the vehicle in the background of his transmission, the engine noise of something moving fast over rough ground. "We're in the valley. Say your position." She could not answer without giving the man below an exact transmission location. She did not answer. Torres understood silence from the field. He had been an NCO for 11 years, and he had been in enough situations where radio silence was itself a message to know that it meant something specific. He did not call again. 70 meters. The man below was moving faster than she would have liked and more confidently than his earlier caution had suggested, which told her he had made a decision about acceptable risk. A person who accepts higher risk is harder to predict. The careful patterns break down, the readable rhythms change. She adjusted 60 meters. She could hear him now. Not clearly, not identifiably, but the specific sound of weight on irregular terrain carried in the still desert air, and she tracked the sound the same way she tracked the visual, not as the center of her attention, but as peripheral confirmation, a second data stream running alongside the primary one. He stopped, directly below a rock formation that she recognized because she had considered using it herself during her first repositioning. He was assessing. She could see his outline, clearly enough to know he was looking up and slightly to his left, which meant his estimate of her position was close but not precise. He thought she was approximately 15 meters further left than she actually was. That 15 meters was everything. She held completely still. In her earpiece, the small secondary receiver she'd kept on throughout the afternoon, she heard, now on a different channel, his voice low and controlled, "Valley secured at the south end. Moving toward the station. Carter, if you can hear this, we're in position." The medevac was coming. The 6 people in the building were about to be reached. She was 70 meters from a man who was looking for her. And she had a decision to make that her training had never quite covered in explicit terms. Because training covers scenarios and scenarios have defined parameters. And the parameter that training had not defined was this. What do you do when the mission is almost complete? When the people you stayed for are almost safe? When you are exhausted and injured, and facing someone who is experienced and close, and has decided that you are his specific objective? What do you do when the margin between almost and completely is exactly the distance between where he thinks you are and where you actually are? She thought about the sergeant in Georgia with the whiteboard and the quiet declarative sentences. She thought about Torres in the valley below, moving toward the medical station with whatever team he'd managed to bring in the secondary vehicle. She thought about 6 people who did not know her name. And then she stopped thinking and let the training take over. Because the training was there for exactly this moment. Not for the easy moments. Not for the moments when the calculation was obvious. For the moments when everything was complicated, and the margin was thin, and the cost of a mistake was paid by someone else. She moved 6 inches to her right, then 12, slowly, with the patience of someone who has practiced patience until it lives in the muscles rather than the mind. She moved away from the position she had held, and toward a new angle, a worse shooting angle, but a better concealment angle. One that placed a specific rock formation between herself and the man below at a geometry that made her effectively invisible from his current position. He would have to move another 20 meters up and 40 degrees to his right before she came back into his possible sight line. She counted on him not knowing that. She counted on the 15 meters of error in his estimate holding long enough for what needed to happen next. The sound from the valley below changed, not dramatically, not with the kind of obvious transformation that announces itself. But Maya heard it through the still air voices. More than one, authoritative, the specific cadence of trained personnel, establishing control of a space. And she understood that Torres had reached the medical station. The man 50 meters below her heard it too. She watched his outline change, watched the head turn toward the valley, watched the body language shift from hunting focus to something more fragmented, the particular physical expression of a person who is suddenly managing two competing threats instead of one. He had a radio. She saw him bring it up. She heard, at a distance too great to make out the words, a brief transmission, a response, another transmission. Then he went still. Whatever was happening in his radio network was changing his calculation. She could see it happening in real time, the way his weight shifted, the way his attention divided, the way the body telegraphed a decision being made that the face and voice couldn't show her at this distance. He looked up the ridge one more time, directly at her position. Or rather, directly at where he believed her position was, 15 meters to her left, which was empty rock and shadow and the specific desert silence of a location that contained nothing he was looking for. He looked for 4 full seconds. She did not breathe. He looked away. He began moving not up, not toward her, but sideways, traversing the ridge, heading toward a descent route on the far end of the valley wall. He was leaving. She did not move. She did not relax. She tracked him through the scope as he traversed, as he found his descent route, as he moved down and away from the ridge, with the same careful deliberateness that had characterized his approach. She tracked him until he was at the valley floor, until he was moving away from the settlement, until he was a shape in the distance, and then a smaller shape, and then nothing she could meaningfully identify through the scope. Only then did she lower the rifle. Only then did she pick up the radio. "Torres," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped dry by hours of controlled breathing in desert air. "East Ridge threat has moved off. Direction is north by northwest. Moving away from your position. Copy." Torres's voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it, a quality of relief so tightly controlled it almost disappeared. "Almost status. I'm functional," she said. "Same answer as before. Still technically true, still generously defined." "The 6, she said. "We have them," Torres said, "all 6. Medevac is on the ground. Carter, all 6. She put the radio against her chest. She sat on the ridge in the fading desert light with a shoulder that had been arguing with her for 2 hours, and a hand that had given up arguing and moved on to simply refusing several of her requests, and she sat there for approximately 30 seconds, doing nothing at all. 30 seconds was what she allowed herself. Moving down was different from moving up. Up, the body leads with intention. Down, the body negotiates with gravity. And when one shoulder is significantly less cooperative than the other, the negotiation is more complicated. She took the descent in sections, identifying each foot placement before committing weight to it, using the rifle as an additional support point in the steeper sections, stopping at intervals to assess and reassess rather than committing to a single continuous line that could take her somewhere she didn't want to go. She thought about the man who had climbed this same ridge 40 minutes ago. She thought about the conversation they'd had, the specific strangeness of it, 2 trained people on opposite sides of everything, talking like people talk when they want to understand something that isn't. Finally, understandable. She thought about what he had said about 16 years. She thought about what she might say if someone asked her in 16 years why she had stayed on that ridge. She thought she would probably give the same incomplete answer he had given. Not because the full answer was secret, because the full answer was too simple for the weight people put on it. She had stayed because there were 6 people who needed her to stay. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. The training mattered. The skills mattered. The years of preparation mattered. But all of those things were instruments. The reason she'd picked up the instruments on that particular afternoon and played them as precisely as she knew how was 6 people in a building at the bottom of a valley who could not move. She reached a wide shelf of rock approximately 40 meters above the valley floor and stopped. From here, she could see the medical station clearly. She could see the medevac helicopter on the cleared ground north of the building. She could see movement medical personnel, the Torres's team, people she recognized by body language and equipment even at this distance. She could see a stretcher being moved. She stood there for a moment and watched it. Not with relief, exactly. With something quieter. The feeling of a person who has been running a calculation for hours and has just seen the answer come back correct. It was correct. Torres met her at the base of the ridge. He was exactly as she remembered him from their last joint training exercise 8 months ago, solidly built, unhurried in his movements, the kind of NCO who had learned long ago that the best way to communicate authority was not to insist on it. He was holding a water bottle, which he extended toward her without saying anything, and she took it and drank most of it before she lowered it. "Shoulder," she said, nodding toward her left side. And the hand. The rest is cosmetic. He looked at the hand. His expression did not change in the theatrical way of someone performing concern, but she noticed the specific way his eyes assessed the injury quickly, professionally, filing the information, and she appreciated the lack of performance. Medics with the six, he said. You're next, I know. Walk me through it, he said. This was standard. After an unplanned solo engagement, you walk through it while it's still clear, before the fatigue and the adrenaline finish metabolizing into the particular fuzzy blur that combat memory becomes if you wait too long. You capture it while the details are still specific and sequenced. She walked him through it. She told him about the formation she had observed, the three distinct movement groups, the radio operator she had identified. She told him about the explosion and the repositioning and the four separate positions she had used over the course of the afternoon. She told him about the conversation on the radio and the decision to stay when the logical calculation said to move. She told him about the man on the ridge. Torres listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she had always respected about him. He listened the way good soldiers listen. Completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking, without filling the pauses with himself. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He could have had your position, Torres said. If he'd confirmed that transmission location, yes. What made you think he wouldn't? She thought about it. He was experienced enough to know that a confirmed position is more dangerous than a probable one. If he confirmed it, and I was in a prepared position, he was committed to a direct approach with no flexibility. The uncertainty gave him options. Experienced operators keep their options. Torres nodded slowly. And the conversation. He was doing the same thing I was doing, she said, running out the clock on his own uncertainty. Neither of us wanted to commit without better information. So you talked until one of you had enough information. Until you arrived and changed his information, she said. When he heard your team in the valley, he didn't have enough time to close on me and disengage before he was exposed. The calculation changed. Torres looked at her for a moment. You knew we were 6 minutes out when you started that conversation. Yes, you ran out the clock, yes. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but carried the same quality. Carter, 6 minutes. 6 minutes is a workable number, she said. He shook his head. Not in disagreement. In the way people shake their heads when something is both difficult to believe and entirely consistent with everything they know about a person. The 6 friendlies are all stable, he said. Sergeant Miller has a serious leg wound that's going to take surgery, but the rest are moderate to minor. Medevac is prepping for transport now. She nodded. All 6, he said again. Yes, she said. They stood for a moment in the open desert air, the medevac's rotors winding up in the background, the light now fully committed to evening, the valley taking on the particular blue-gray quality that desert light achieves in the 20 minutes before full dark. She thought about the 6 people being loaded onto the medevac. She thought about the fact that they would be in surgery or in recovery by the time she finished her after-action report, and that by the time they were well enough to ask questions, the answers would be in a report they might never read, filed by people they might never meet, describing actions taken by someone whose name they might never know. She was at peace with that. She had always been at peace with that. You need to sit down, Torres said, not urgently but clearly. In a minute, she said. She looked toward the north, in the direction the man from the ridge had gone. The valley was quiet. The desert was quiet. Whatever had been in motion for the last several hours had moved on, dispersed, resolved into the specific silence that follows the kind of afternoon that leaves marks. She thought about what he had said. The people in that building don't know you exist. They cannot see you. They will never know what you did up here today. She thought about her answer, the answer she hadn't given out loud, the one she'd been carrying quietly through the entire descent from the ridge. They don't need to. That was the complete version of the simple thing she had never quite been able to make people understand when they asked why she did what she did, why she stayed when she could have gone, why she held a line that everyone said couldn't be held. She did not do it to be known. She did not do it to be thanked. She did it because it needed to be done, and she was the one in the position to do it. And that, in her understanding of things, was the entire explanation. Everything else was detail. Carter Torres said. Okay, she said. She turned away from the north. She started walking toward the medical personnel and the light and the people who were waiting. Her shoulder continued its ongoing complaint. Her hand remained unreliable. She walked anyway, the way she had done everything else that afternoon. One deliberate step at a time, each one a decision, each one a commitment, all of them adding up to the only outcome she had ever considered. Acceptable. Everybody alive. Mission complete. Above her, the first stars were appearing in the Arizona sky, indifferent and permanent and very far away. And somewhere in the valley behind her, the medevac was lifting into the air with 6 people who did not know her name. And she listened to the sound of the rotors until it faded into the distance. And then she listened to the silence that came after. And the silence was clean. It was the kind of silence you could rest in. She kept walking. The medic's name was Specialist Reyes, and he had the particular quality of someone who had learned to work fast without looking like he was working fast. He examined Maya's shoulder with fingers that were precise and unhurried, pressing carefully along the collarbone and the muscle group below it, while she sat on a supply crate outside the medical station and held herself very still. Torres stood 3 feet away with his arms crossed, watching the valley perimeter, doing the thing NCOs do when they want to give someone privacy, while simultaneously refusing to actually leave. "Tell me when it's sharp versus when it's pressure," Reyes said. "It's all pressure," she said, "nothing sharp." "That's better than I expected." He moved to the hand, unwrapped the field dressing she'd applied herself, examined the cut beneath it with a small light. "This is deeper than it looks in field conditions. You're going to need stitches." "How many?" "7. Maybe 8. "Fine." He began cleaning the wound and she looked away. Not because of squeamishness, but because she had learned over years of field medicine that watching what was being done to your own body created a specific, unhelpful feedback loop between the eyes and the nervous system. Better to look at something neutral. She looked at the northern end of the valley, now dark, thought about what was out there, and decided that nothing out there was her problem anymore for at least the next several hours. "You know," Reyes said, working steadily, "when Sergeant Torres told us what had happened up here, I thought the radio was malfunctioning." "It was," she said. "That was part of the problem. I mean, I thought the numbers were wrong." She looked at him. He was still focused on the hand, not meeting her eyes, which told her he was saying this because he needed to say it and not because he was asking for a response. 14 is a lot of individuals," he said. "Yes," she agreed. And he stopped. Started again. "Sergeant Miller, the one with the leg." When we got to him, the first thing he said was that he'd heard gunfire outside. He said he and the others were certain they were about to be overrun. He said there was a point where the firing stopped and the voices outside stopped, and he thought. Reyes paused, and she noticed his hands had stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. He thought that was it. She said nothing, and then it was quiet, Reyes said. Quiet for a long time. And no one came through the door. "No," she said, "no one did." Reyes finished cleaning the wound in silence. Then he asked who was out there. Miller did. He asked Torres who was responsible for the outer perimeter. What did Torres tell him? He told him it was a recon specialist. That's all. Reyes finally looked up. He had steady eyes, the kind that had learned to stay neutral through considerable practice. Miller said to tell that person that he has a daughter named Clara who is 4 years old, and that Clara's father is going home because of whoever was on that ridge. The valley was very quiet. "You can tell Sergeant Miller. I'm glad his daughter's father is going home," Maya said. Her voice was even. She made sure of it. Torres came to her while Reyes was finishing the last of the stitches. He crouched down to her level, which was the posture he used when he wanted a conversation to feel like a conversation rather than a debrief, and he held out a protein bar that she took and ate mechanically because she understood her body needed fuel even when her appetite had no opinion on the matter. "Command is going to want the full report tonight," he said. "You know that." "I know. They're also going to want to know about the individual on the ridge. The one who came up after you." She chewed, swallowed, thought about how to describe what she knew and what she didn't know. Experienced. 16 plus years by his own account. He was the most tactically sophisticated of the group. The others, most of the others, they were operating on confidence and numbers. He was operating on something older than that. "Did you get eyes on his face?" "Not clearly. Distance and light were both wrong." "But you identified him as the command element?" "Not initially. Initially, I thought the command element was in the middle group 4 experienced fighters, one of whom had a specific way of communicating instructions through gesture rather than voice. But the man on the ridge was something separate. He wasn't commanding the formation. He was overseeing it. There's a difference." Torres was quiet for a moment. Overseeing. He let the others run the operation. He observed. When the operation ran into trouble, the others looked to each other. He didn't step in. He waited. She finished the protein bar, folded the wrapper, until the formation broke down completely. Then he made a unilateral decision to come up the ridge. No consultation, no instruction to the others. Just a decision and then movement. "You think he's the one who was running the broader operation?" I think he's the one the broader operation was running for, she said. That's different. Torres looked at her for a moment with the expression he used when something had given him a new angle on a problem. What do they want here? He said in the valley. The equipment cache at the OP was already destroyed in the blast. The 6 friendlies were communications personnel. Nothing classified on their person. I know, she said. So what's the objective? She had been thinking about this since the conversation on the ridge. Since the man's voice had said, I am not here for the people in the building. That part is done. The 6 weren't the primary objective. Neither was the op. I think we were in the way of something else. The settlement has been abandoned for years, but the terrain around it. She stopped. What's north of this valley, Torres thought. Old transit corridor. The kind that doesn't appear on current maps because nobody updated them after the route was reclassified. Something moves through here, she said, regularly, and we happen to be sitting on top of it. Torres stood up slowly. She watched his face in the low light from the medical station, watched the calculation happening behind his eyes. I'm putting that in the report, he said. It's a theory. It's a theory from someone who just spent 6 hours reading that valley better than anyone else currently alive, he said. It goes in the report. The medical station had become a different place from what it had been 3 hours ago. Torres's team's 6 people in the secondary vehicle, 2 of them with medical cross-training, had secured the exterior and were conducting a systematic assessment of the surrounding area. The 6 wounded personnel were either on the medevac or stable enough to await the second transport that had been called in. The space itself, which had been a place of desperate quiet earlier in the afternoon, now had the controlled noise of people doing specific jobs with clear objectives. Maya walked through it on her way to find somewhere to sit that wasn't a supply crate, and she passed the area where 2 of Torres' team were photographing what remained of the enemy's incursion equipment left behind in the confusion: a discarded radio, a pack that had been abandoned near the station's north entrance. She stopped. She looked at the abandoned pack. Something about its placement bothered her. It was sitting 5 feet from the north entrance, positioned with the top flap open, contents partially visible. A water container, a folded cloth, the corner of something that might have been a document folder. Has anyone cleared that? She said to the nearest team member, a young specialist named Ortega, who was photographing the radio. Ortega looked over. Visually cleared. Haven't opened it yet. Waiting for. Who was near the north entrance, she said. Ortega frowned. What do you mean? During the engagement, which of the 14 was closest to the north entrance? Ortega shook his head. He didn't know. He had arrived after. Maya walked to the pack and crouched in front of it, careful about the shoulder, and looked at it without touching it. The placement was wrong. 5 feet from the entrance, top flap open, visible contents. It was positioned like something that had been dropped by someone moving fast, someone who had reached the entrance before having to turn back. But the flap being open was what bothered her. People who drop packs in a hurry don't generally drop them open side up. The pack would have to have been placed that way deliberately or turned that way after it landed. Torres, she said, loud enough to carry. He appeared from the interior of the station. He looked at her crouching in front of the pack. He looked at her face. He understood immediately that this was not a casual observation. Clear the entrance area, he said to the room, not loud, not urgent. The tone of someone who has learned that controlled instruction produces faster results than alarm. People moved. Torres crouched beside her. He looked at the pack. Talk to me. The placement, she said, the flap. If someone dropped this running away from the entrance, the flap would be under it or to the side. It's positioned so that what's inside is visible. It's meant to be found, or meant to be opened, she said. Torres looked at her for a moment. The man on the ridge, he said. He knew we were coming. He knew the operation was going to result in a location sweep. She kept her voice low and even. If he wanted to leave something for us to find, he wouldn't hand-deliver it. He'd leave it where a systematic sweep would find it naturally. And he'd make it visible enough to be found, but positioned to look accidental. Yes. Torres was quiet for 30 seconds. This was a very long time for Torres to be quiet, and she recognized the quality of the silence as him running multiple contingency calculations simultaneously. Could be an IED, he said. It could be, she agreed. It could also be that he's done something more complicated than that. What do you mean? She looked at the document folder visible in the corner of the open pack. He asked me what I was holding for, on the ridge. He spent 2 minutes asking me why I would stay for people who couldn't see me, who would never know what I'd done. She paused. That's not small talk. That's not intimidation. He was working through something. And you think he left an answer in the pack? I think he left something. What it is, I don't know. Torres straightened up. He called over his team's EOD qualified member, A compact, methodical sergeant named Park, and explained what they were looking at. Park examined the pack for 4 minutes with equipment that Maya didn't fully understand and then stood up and said, in the particular tone of someone delivering professional judgment, no explosive components. Clean. Torres looked at Maya. He opened the pack. The document folder contained a single sheet of paper. It was not a coded message. It was not a map. It was not intelligence in any form that a report could categorize neatly. It was a handwritten note. In English, 5 lines, written in the careful block letters of someone who was writing in a second language and wanted to be understood clearly. Torres read it once. He handed it to Maya without a word. She read it. The note said, I have done this for 16 years. I have never sent a warning. You sent one. That is a different kind of soldier. The people in the building deserved better people. Today they had one. We will not be back to this valley. There was no signature. She read it twice. She folded it along its original crease and handed it back to Torres. It goes in the report, she said. Her voice was completely neutral. Yes, he said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. You okay? I'm functional, she said. Torres made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Carter, off the record. Are you okay? She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the ridge and the shoulder and the hand and the 6 hours and the 14 men and the conversation in the dark and the note written in careful block letters by a man who had spent 16 years doing something that had apparently, at some point this afternoon, briefly troubled him. Ask me in the morning, she said. Fair enough, Torres said. The second transport arrived at 7:18 and took the remaining 2 wounded personnel who had been too stable for the medevac, but too injured for a road transport of any significant length. Maya watched them loaded from the doorway of the medical station, her injured hand wrapped and her shoulder temporarily immobilized in a field sling that Reyes had applied with the same quiet efficiency he'd brought to everything else. Torres appeared beside her. Transport for us is 40 minutes out, he said. They want us out of the valley before full dark. You should rest until then. I will, she said. She did not move from the doorway. Torres stayed beside her, not talking, not moving either. This was one of his qualities. She had always found grounding, he understood, when presence was what was needed and conversation was not. After a while, she said, the formation today. The 3 groups. You know what the middle group reminds me of? Tell me. The training exercise in Georgia. The one with Sergeant Pierce, where we ran the asymmetric response scenarios. She shifted her weight carefully, managing the shoulder. He broke us into 3 groups in exactly that way. Aggressive forward element, experience center, support and communications rear. He said that configuration was the most efficient use of mixed capability units because it maximized the effective range of the experienced element without requiring them to lead the assault. Torres thought for a moment. Pierce called that the leverage configuration. Yes, because the experienced center acts as a lever multiplying the force of the forward element without being exposed to its primary risk. And today they used it correctly. The forward element hit the settlement entrance. The center managed angles and communications. The rear provided coordination. She paused. But the man on the ridge wasn't part of the configuration. He was outside it. Observer position, Torres said. More than that. Pierce had a term for it. Do you remember? Torres thought. Final authority, she said. The element that doesn't participate in the operation unless the operation fails. The element that's only activated when something has gone wrong enough that standard configuration responses are insufficient. He was the break glass option, yes. And the formation failing the formation that failed because of what I did on that ridge, that's what activated him. She looked at Torres, which means whoever runs the broader operation considered the valley important enough to have a final authority present. Not just a field commander, a final authority. The weight of that landed between them. Torres was quiet for a moment. This gets more complicated the further you pull the thread, he said. Yes, she agreed. The report is going to get a lot of attention. I know. You're going to be in rooms with people who ask better questions than I do. Your questions are fine, she said. He made a small sound of acknowledgement. What do we know about the corridor north of here? Right now, what I told you before, it's old, reclassified, not on current maps. And what do you think is moving through it? She didn't answer immediately. She had a theory. And it was a theory she was willing to put in a report, but not willing to state out loud in a dark doorway on insufficient information. Because the specific theory she had assembled from the afternoon's evidence was the kind of theory that, if she was right, meant this afternoon had been significantly larger than a recovery mission gone complicated. I think, she said carefully, that the right people need to look at that corridor before I say what I think is moving through it. Torres heard the weight behind the careful language. She saw him hear it. First thing in the report, he said quietly. First thing, she agreed. She finally sat down. There was a low bench along the interior east wall of the medical station, positioned there for reasons that probably made sense when the building was operational and no longer made sense now but remained useful, and she sat on it with her back against the wall, and her good arm resting on her knee, and the injured shoulder elevated in the sling, at the angle Reyes had specified, and she allowed herself, for the first time since 3:15 in the afternoon, when the support team had radioed about the broken axle, to stop managing what came next and simply be where she was. She was in a recovered medical station in the desert. Her shoulder was damaged. Her hand had 7 stitches. 6 people who had been waiting to be overrun were on their way to a hospital. The valley was quiet. She was still here. She had not intended to think about her mother during the silence that followed. Her mother lived in Flagstaff, 2.5 hours north, and called every Sunday morning at 9, and she had never once in Maya's entire military career asked a specific question about what her daughter actually did. She asked about food and sleep, and whether Maya was staying warm, and whether the people around her were treating her well. And she asked these questions with the specific focus of someone who had decided that the questions she most wanted to ask were the ones she least had the right to ask. Maya had always understood this and respected it, and occasionally, in moments like this one, found it more painful than any direct question would have been. She wondered if her mother would ever hear about this afternoon. She thought probably not in full, probably in the filtered version. That filtered versions always became something happened. Someone did something, it worked out. The architecture of the actual afternoon, the 14 men, and the broken radio, and the 4 repositions, and the conversation, in the dark, and the note in the block letters, all of that would stay in reports and memories and the specific understanding of the people who had been there. Her mother would get the summary. Her mother would be relieved by the summary and troubled by what the summary wasn't saying, and would call on Sunday morning and ask about food and sleep. And Maya would answer, and the conversation would be warm. And the gap between them would be exactly the shape it had always been. And both of them understood the shape too well to try to close it. That was what this cost. Not the shoulder, not the hand. Those would heal in measurable timelines with predictable outcomes. The cost was the gap, the unclosable distance between the thing you had lived and the version of the thing that could be shared with the people who loved you, and the knowledge that the gap itself was a form of protection, that the very unclosability of it was what allowed the people you loved to sleep without knowing what the darkness actually cost. Torres appeared in the doorway. Transport is 30 minutes out, he said. Okay, he looked at her sitting against the wall. You look like someone who's thinking thoughts that are too heavy for a bench. I'm thinking about my mother, she said. He sat down on the other end of the bench. He understood the category of thought without needing more specification. He had a wife in San Antonio and 2 daughters whose ages she could never quite remember. 8 and 11, she thought, and he called them every night he was in the field, from whatever signal he could get, and he never talked about those calls, which was how she knew they cost him something. She's going to worry when you get back, he said. She worries now, Maya said. The worrying is constant. The specifics just change. At least the specifics today are ones that end with you on a bench, he said. She looked at him. That's a low bar, Torres. It's the only bar that matters, he said. They sat in quiet for a while. She could hear the 2 remaining team members outside, moving through the exterior perimeter check, their voices low and methodical. She could hear the desert itself, the particular silence that filled the space where the helicopters had been. She could hear her own breathing, finally slow, finally settling into something that didn't require active management. She heard it before Torres did. The sound was faint, almost below the threshold of notice, the kind of signal that arrives at the ear as a sensation before it arrives as information. She was off the bench before she fully processed what she was hearing, her body reacting with the speed that hours of heightened awareness produces. And Torres came up a half second after her because he had heard her move, and that was enough. What he said, low and immediate, east, she said. Her hand was already on the secondary pistol at her hip because the rifle was leaning against the wall 6 feet behind her. And 6 feet was currently a distance she didn't want between herself and a weapon. They both listened. There it was again. Not a footstep. Not a voice. Something between them, the specific sound of weight being redistributed, the sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to make a sound and are almost succeeding. Team Torres said into his radio, quiet and controlled. East exterior, sound check now, a beat. Ortega's voice came back, east exterior, clear on visual. Nothing moving. Keep eyes on it, Torres. Then from the east exterior, Ortega's voice again, and this time the control in it was more deliberate. The kind of control you apply when you are actually unsettled and choosing not to be. Sergeant Torres. I have a person, approximately 40 meters east, sitting, not moving, not armed, I can see both hands. Torres looked at Maya. She looked at Torres and Torres said into the radio. One person, Ortega confirmed, seated on the ground. Hands visible. Not moving them, Torres said. 30 seconds passed. Then Ortega, they're not responding to the verbal. They understand it, I can see the head turn when I talk. They're just not responding. Maya put the pistol back in the holster. Carter, I'll go, she said again. Torres looked at her for 2 full seconds. She held the look without moving. He stepped aside. She went out the east entrance. Ortega was standing at approximately 15 meters from the figure, weapon in ready position, body language carrying the particular tension of someone who had been trained for physical threats and was currently facing something that didn't match the training template. Maya moved past him. She covered the 40 meters to the seated figure at a steady pace, not hurrying, not slowing. She stopped 5 feet in front of him and looked down. He was young. That was the first thing. She had assembled a mental image of the 14 based on their movement equipment, and it had not included young. It had included capable, organized, purposeful. But this one was young, early 20s at most, and the youth was visible even in the desert dark in a way that movement and purpose had concealed during the afternoon. He was sitting cross-legged with his hands on his knees, exactly as Ortega had described, and he was looking up at her with an expression she needed a moment to identify correctly because it was not what she expected. He was not angry. He was not strategic. He was not performing surrender. He looked exhausted and lost in the specific way of someone who has reached the end of something and has not yet been told what comes next. She crouched down to his level. Speak English, she said. Pause. Then some. What's your name? He looked at her for a long time. Darius, he said finally. The word came out like something he hadn't planned to say. Darius, she said, how old are you? Another long pause. 21. She kept her voice even. Why are you still here, Darius? He looked at his hands on his knees. He looked at them for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he looked back up at her and said, in English that was careful and imperfect and entirely clear, because he said to stay. Who said to stay? The man. Darius said, the one who went up to the ridge. He said, one of you stays. One of you shows the hands. One of you tells them where the others went. Maya felt the back of her neck change temperature. She kept her face completely neutral. He told you to wait here, she said. To let us find you, yes. And tell us where the others went. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. 21 years old, sitting in the desert dark with his hands on his knees, doing exactly what the man with 16 years of experience had told him to do. Because that was what you did when someone with 16 years of experience gave you a direct instruction. Where did they go? She said. He told her. She listened to every word, without interrupting and without looking away from his face, because when someone is telling you something important, you owe them the courtesy of your full attention. When he was done, she stood up. She looked back at Torres, who had moved to 15 meters back, and was watching with the particular quality of someone who understood. He was watching something significant without being close enough to know what it was. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed north. Torres understood. She saw it in the way he immediately keyed his radio. She looked back at Darius. Stand up slowly, she said. Keep your hands where I can see them. Nobody is going to hurt you, but you're going to answer some more questions. He stood up slowly, the way she asked. He kept his hands visible. He was taller than she'd expected from his seated posture, and he moved with the particular stiffness of someone who had been sitting in the same position for a long time and whose body was reminding them about it. He looked at her with an expression that was still exhausted and lost, and something else now. Something she identified after a moment as something close to relief. The specific relief of a 21-year-old who has been given a task that required him to make himself vulnerable in the dark, and has done it exactly as instructed, and is now, for the first time in hours, done being responsible for it. He said, Darius told her, almost as an afterthought, that you would listen. She looked at him. The man on the ridge, Darius said. He said, she will listen. She is the kind of soldier who listens. Maya said nothing for a moment. Then, come with me. She walked him back toward the medical station. Behind her, to the north, Torres was already coordinating with command on whatever Darius had just told her about the corridor and the movement, and the specific location where the other 13 men had been redirected by a man who had spent 16 years doing this, and this afternoon made a choice that was not entirely explained by tactical calculation alone. Maya didn't look north. She kept walking. The 21-year-old named Darius walked beside her with his hands visible, doing exactly what he'd been told, and she thought about a man who had left a note in careful block letters and given instructions to a young soldier and gone north, into the dark, carrying something that the afternoon had apparently given him to carry. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what it meant. She knew she would think about it for a long time. The desert was cold now, the way deserts become cold fast once the light is gone, the temperature dropping with a speed that's always surprised people who thought of deserts as permanently hot. And she felt it on her arms and through the material of her jacket, and in the ache of her shoulder, which had quieted from a shout to a low, persistent statement of fact. She was still here. The valley was still quiet. Somewhere north, in a corridor that wasn't on current maps, something was moving through the dark. And tomorrow, when the reports were filed and the rooms with better questions were convened, the thread she had pulled this afternoon was going to unravel into something considerably larger than a recovery mission gone wrong. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she walked a 21-year-old named Darius into the light of the medical station, and she told Ortega to get him water. And she sat back down on the bench against the east wall, and she thought about her mother calling on Sunday morning and asking about food and sleep. And she thought, I will tell her the food was bad and I did not sleep enough. And that will be the truth. Just not all of it. The transport arrived 12 minutes late. Maya knew this because she had been counting. Not obsessively, not with the tight focus she'd used to count minutes on the ridge, but with the background awareness of someone whose sense of time had been recalibrated by 6 hours of precise interval management and hadn't fully released yet. Her body was still running on field time, which was a different instrument than clock time, more granular, more physical, measured in heartbeats and breath cycles and the specific quality of silence between sounds. Darius was sitting against the north wall of the medical station with a foil blanket around his shoulders and a water bottle in both hands, drinking slowly and steadily the way people drink when they have been dehydrated long enough that their body is no longer producing thirst signals correctly. Ortega was 3 feet away, seated on an upturned crate, saying nothing, simply present. This was the correct approach, and Maya noticed it and filed it as a mark. In Ortega's favor, the instinct to provide presence without pressure to a person who was clearly running on the last of something. Torres was outside coordinating the intelligence Darius had provided with the command element on the other end of his radio. She could hear fragments of his voice through the east wall, controlled and methodical, the cadence of someone transmitting high-priority information in the compressed, precise language that intelligence reports required. She was watching Darius, not because she thought he was a threat. The threat assessment on Darius had resolved itself fairly quickly into something uncomplicated. He was 21 years old. He had been given instructions by a man he clearly regarded as an absolute authority, and he had followed those instructions with the specific completeness of someone who did not have a framework for doing otherwise. He was not calculating. He was not performing. He was simply a young man at the end of a day that had apparently surprised him as much as it had surprised everyone else. What she was watching for was something different. She was watching for the moment when the initial relief of having completed his instruction started to be replaced by the awareness of what came next. That moment always arrived, in her experience, somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour, after a person stopped being in motion and started being still. The body stopped managing the immediate, and the mind filled the space with everything it had been postponing. She was watching for it when it arrived in Darius. At 8:07 it arrived. She saw it in the way his hands tightened slightly on the water bottle, in the way his eyes changed focus from the middle distance to something closer, something interior. She saw it in the small movement of his jaw that wasn't quite swallowing and wasn't quite speaking, but was the body's physical response to a thought that had weight to it. She stood up from the bench and crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside him. Not close, a comfortable distance, the way you sit beside someone when you want them to know you are available, without requiring them to manage your presence. What happens to me now, he said. His English, she noticed, was better than the careful, imperfect version he'd used outside. The first exchange had been cautious, conserving, using the minimum language necessary to be understood. This was something closer to his actual fluency. You answer questions, she said, honestly. And then the people asking the questions decide what the next steps are. Will I go to prison? She considered her answer for 2 seconds. I don't know specifically. That depends on what you tell them and what they determine about your level of involvement. I was involved, he said. It was not a confession. It was a statement of fact delivered with the flatness of someone who had already made a decision not to lie about it. I know. Does that matter that I know I was involved? It matters to some people, she said. It matters to the kind of people who have to make decisions about what happens next. Whether you knew what you were doing and whether you made choices about it versus whether someone with 16 years of authority told you to be somewhere and you were there. He looked at the water bottle in his hands. He told me to be there. I believe you, she said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she recognized the particular surprise of a person who had expected to be disbelieved and isn't. It was a vulnerable expression, and it was real, he said. Because of how you waited, she said. Someone who has made fully independent choices about what they're doing doesn't sit in the dark with their hands on their knees waiting to be found. Someone who is following an instruction and who takes instructions seriously does exactly what you did. He absorbed this. He said you would understand. The man on the ridge. Yes. What did he tell you about me? Darius thought for a moment, the careful thought of someone assembling a translation. He said she sent a warning before she acted. He said that meant she was a person who hoped she was wrong. He said that was a different kind of soldier than the ones he usually encountered. Maya was quiet for a moment. He said that, she said. Yes. When after he came back down, Darius said. After the valley went quiet. He gathered the ones who were still there. Not everyone. Some had already gone, and he told us to go north. And he told me to stay. And then he said those things about the soldier on the ridge, and he left. She processed the sequence. He came back down before he went north. Yes. He came back down and spoke to us, and then he went north. Separately from the others, she filed this. It was a new piece of the shape she had been assembling since she read the note in the block letters, and it changed the geometry of the shape in a way that would matter when she was in the rooms with the better questions. 8:19 p.m. Torres came back inside and saw Maya sitting on the floor next to Darius. He did not comment on this. He sat on the bench she had vacated and looked at them both with the expression of someone carrying news that required careful delivery. Command is sending a dedicated intelligence team, he said. ETA is 3 hours. They want Darius held here until they arrive. Darius's hands tightened on the water bottle again. He'll be treated appropriately, Torres said, directing this at Darius with a deliberateness that told Maya he had made a decision about how to handle this particular situation. You're being held for questioning, not detention. There's a difference in how the next several hours will work. Darius looked at Maya as if checking whether this was true. She gave him a small nod. His hands relaxed slightly. The corridor, Torres said, now looking at Maya. Command pulled the archived routing data on it. You were right. It's been active recently. Not on any current monitoring rotation, because the reclassification 3 years ago moved it off the standard surveillance schedule. What's been moving through it? That's what the intelligence team is coming to figure out. But the preliminary assessment, Torres paused, and she recognized the pause as him choosing how much to say in front of Darius. He made a decision. The preliminary assessment is consistent with what you theorized. She nodded. How far up does this go? Above my pay grade, Torres said, which is itself an answer. It is. She looked at the east wall for a moment, in the direction of north, where the man with 16 years and careful block letters and a 21-year-old left behind as a message had gone, after coming down from the ridge that she'd held since just after 4 in the afternoon. She thought about what it meant that he had come back down before going north. She thought about the specific sequence. Come back. Speak to the remaining group. Give Darius an instruction. Speak briefly about the soldier on the ridge. Leave. He had not simply left. He had closed the operation properly. He had given a final order, provided context for it, and then moved. That was not the behavior of a person fleeing. That was the behavior of a person concluding. There was a difference between those two things, and the difference was going to be important in the rooms with the better questions. Torres, she said. Yeah, when the intelligence team arrives, I want to be in the first session. He looked at her shoulder in the sling, at the bandaged hand. Carter, I was there, she said. I have direct observational knowledge of the formation, the command structure, the behavior patterns of the senior element, and the content of 2 direct communications. The intelligence team is going to spend their first hour reconstructing a picture that I already have. Put me in the first session. Torres looked at her for a long time. She held the look. I'll make the request, he said. Thank you. You should sleep until they arrive. I know, she said. She did not sleep. What she did instead was walk the exterior perimeter of the medical station with Ortega, which served both as a security purpose and as a way of being in motion, without being in a situation that required decisions. The desert was fully dark now, and the temperature had dropped to something that required the jacket she had pulled from the secondary vehicle's equipment storage. And she walked the perimeter at a pace that her shoulder tolerated and her legs were grateful for. Ortega walked beside her. He was quiet for the first 3 circuits, and then, on the 4th, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The warning you sent," he said, "before the engagement. Did you actually think they'd turn back?" She considered the question. "No, then why send it?" She had thought about this, actually. Not obsessively, but with the quiet persistence of someone who examines their own decisions. The same way they examine everything else, not to second-guess them, but to understand them clearly enough to learn from them. "Because I needed to know that I had," she said. When things go wrong in a confrontation, and things went wrong in multiple ways today, the place your mind goes is to the beginning, to the first decision. If I had not sent the warning, the first decision would have been to act without warning, and that would have been with me for everything that came after it. Ortega was quiet for a moment, even though sending it gave them information about your position. "Yes." He stopped. "Say it," she said. "That's a harder calculation than I think I could run in real time," he said. "It gets easier," she said, "not the decision itself, but the running of it. The faster you can identify what the decision is actually, about what the core question is, the faster you can resolve it." She paused. The warning wasn't about tactics. The tactic said, "Don't send it." The warning was about what I could live with afterward. Once I identified that, the decision was 30 seconds. Ortega absorbed this. They walked in silence for another half circuit. Then he said, "The man on the ridge. Do you think he's going to come back?" She thought about the note. "We will not be back to this valley." She thought about the specific quality of the statement, not a threat withdrawn, but a statement of intent, made by a man who had spent 16 years having his statements of intent mean something. "Not to this valley," she said, "but somewhere." "Someone like that doesn't stop," she said. "He changes direction, he changes approach, he recalculates. But he doesn't stop, and he's still out there." "Yes, does that?" Ortega paused, choosing the word. "Does that concern you?" She thought about the honest answer and gave it. "It concerns me in the way that any unresolved situation concerns me. Not personally, professionally." She glanced at him. "The personal part is the part that knows I ran the right calculation today, and I'll run the right calculation the next time there is one. The professional part is the part that knows he's running calculations too, and tomorrow those calculations are going to be different from today's, because today changed something for him." "Changed what?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what concerns me." They came back inside to find Torres on the radio with an elevated urgency that he was managing expertly, but that was visible to Maya in the specific way she had learned to read his baseline over years of working in the same unit. His baseline was methodical and unhurried. This was methodical and very slightly accelerated. She waited until he was off the radio. "What happened?" she said. He looked at her. He looked at Ortega. He made a decision. "Ortega, can you give us a minute?" Ortega nodded and moved to the exterior without requiring further explanation. Torres looked at Maya. "The intelligence team is being bumped up," he said. "ETA is now 90 minutes instead of 3 hours. Why? Because the archived routing data on the corridor turned up something." He paused. "The corridor has been active for approximately 4 months. Regular suggests." Another pause. One was longer. "It suggests it's not a transit route. It's a supply route." She felt the architecture of the afternoon rearrange itself slightly. "Apply to what?" she said. "That's what the intelligence team is coming to determine." He looked at her steadily. "But the reason they're coming faster is because the corridor appears on a watch list that was established 8 months ago, related to a series of incidents in 3 other states." She held his eyes. "This isn't a local operation." "It appears not, and we were sitting on it."
Yes.
"Because a recovery mission sent us to an abandoned OP that happened to be directly above an active supply corridor. That is the current working theory, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Was the original OP placement coincidental?" Torres looked at her for a long moment. "That is one of the questions the intelligence team will be asking." The implications settled between them, like something heavy being set down carefully. "If it wasn't coincidental," she said slowly, "then someone knew the corridor was there when the OP was originally positioned 3 years ago." "Yes, and that means someone knew it was there when we were sent to recover equipment from it." That is a possible reading, Torres said carefully. It is also possible that the OP was positioned before the corridor became active, and the correlation is coincidental. What does your instinct say? He was quiet for seconds. For Torres, 5 seconds of quiet before answering was the equivalent of a much longer pause from someone else. My instinct, he said finally, says that the next 90 minutes are going to change the shape of this significantly. She nodded, Carter. He said her name the way he said it when the next thing he was going to say was something he had decided to say as her NCO rather than her colleague. She recognized the register. You did not know any of this when you held that ridge. I know. You held it because 6 people needed it held. That is the beginning and end of what you did today. I know, she said again. Whatever the intelligence team finds, whatever the next shape of this is, that doesn't change. She looked at him. She understood what he was doing, and she was grateful for it. And she also understood that the thing he was trying to protect her from was a thing she had already encountered and set aside on the bench against the east wall an hour ago. Torres, she said, I know what I did and I know why I did it. Whatever is north of here doesn't change that. He studied her face. You sure? He nodded. He moved toward the exterior to resume his coordination. She sat back down on the bench. She thought about the question she had not asked him, the one that had appeared in her mind when he said the correlation might not be coincidental. She had not asked it because asking it tonight, in this space, before the intelligence team arrived, would have been the wrong sequence. You don't ask the operational question before you have the operational basis. You wait until you have enough to ask it correctly. But she was going to ask it. The question was, who sent us here? Darius had fallen asleep. She noticed this when she looked across the room and found him still against the north wall, with the foil blanket around his shoulders, and his head dropped forward at the specific angle of someone who had not intended to sleep and had been overtaken by it. The water bottle was still loosely in one hand. She watched his breathing for a moment, slow, regular, the uncomplicated breathing of someone whose body had made an executive decision about the next hour without consulting the mind. She thought about what he had told her outside. The sequence of events after the valley went quiet. The man on the ridge coming back down. Speaking to the remaining group. The specific instruction, one of you stays. The specific information, she will listen. She had been turning this over since he said it, looking at it from different angles, because the shape of it was unusual. A senior operational figure, ending an operation that had failed, taking the time to leave behind a deliberate message in two formats, a written note and a human messenger, was not a standard operational behavior. Standard behavior was extraction and reassessment. Standard behavior was distance and silence. This was not standard behavior. This was communication. And communication, in her experience, was always about something. The note had said, "We will not be back to this valley." The messenger had said, "She will listen." Together, those two statements formed something that she kept trying to categorize and couldn't quite, because it didn't fit neatly into any operational category she had encountered. It wasn't a truce. A truce had terms and required acknowledgement. It wasn't intelligence in the formal sense. It was closer to, she searched for the right word and arrived at it after a moment, acknowledgement. Not of her specifically, of something she had represented this afternoon. Something he had found significant enough to spend time on at the end of an operation that had gone badly for him. She thought about what she had represented. She had sent a warning before she acted. She had stayed when she could have left. She had talked when she could have acted, and she had acted when she could have waited. And she had made each of those decisions based on the specific requirements of the situation rather than a fixed approach. She had been, she supposed, unpredictable in the specific way that principled people are unpredictable, not random, but rooted in something that doesn't bend when the situation changes. And that apparently had meant something to a man who had spent 16 years encountering a different kind of soldier. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She wasn't sure it required her to do anything with it. 9:19 p.m. The intelligence team arrived in 2 vehicles 40 minutes before their revised ETA, which told her they had been moving before the formal acceleration of the timeline, which told her they had already been tracking this situation before the call from Torres had redirected them. They were 4 people. 2 in civilian clothes, 2 in military. The mixed composition that told Maya this was a joint operation of a kind she recognized without being able to specify it exactly. They moved through the station entrance with the particular efficiency of people who had been briefed in transit and were already operating on a working model of the situation. The lead civilian was a woman, mid-40s, with the specific quality of contained authority that comes from years of running rooms rather than participating in them. She introduced herself as Navarro and shook Maya's hand, the good one, which she offered automatically, and held the handshake one, beat longer than social convention required, which was a technique Maya recognized as deliberate. It was the technique of someone establishing a direct personal connection before a professional interaction, compressing the relationship building into a handshake so that the conversation that followed could start from a different baseline. Special Agent Navarro, Torres said, completing the introduction. The report got to the right desk faster than expected. The corridor has been on our desk for 4 months, Navarro said. She looked at Maya steadily. Your observations from this afternoon are the most significant direct intelligence we've had on the senior element in that entire period. Maya said nothing. She waited. I'd like to debrief you immediately, Navarro said. I know you've had a full day. I know you're injured. I'm asking anyway because what you observed in the 6 hours on that ridge is going to start degrading as a memory source within the next 12 hours, and I want it while it's still precise. I told Torres I wanted to be in the first session, Maya said. That hasn't changed. Navarro looked at her for a moment with an expression that was close to approval, close enough that Maya noticed it without remarking on it. Then let's start, Navarro said. 9:24 p.m. They sat across from each other at the supply table in the interior of the station. Navarro, with a tablet and a small recorder. Maya with the injured hand flat on the table and the sling adjusted to a position Reyes had approved for extended sitting. One of the military members was also in the room, seated against the wall, not introduced, present in the capacity of someone there to listen rather than participate. Start at the beginning, Navarro said. Not the mission brief, I have that. Start at the moment you first observed the formation. Maya started at the moment she first observed the formation. She talked for 41 minutes without significant interruption. Navarro asked focused, precise questions at the natural breaks, not to redirect, but to sharpen, to pull the specific detail out of the general account. Maya answered each question with the same standard she had applied to everything else this afternoon, accurately, completely, without editorializing. When she reached the conversation on the ridge, Navarro's entire quality of attention changed. Not dramatically, she was too practiced for dramatic tells, but the small things shifted. The tablet stylus stopped moving. The posture adjusted almost imperceptibly forward. The interval between Maya's words and Navarro's next question lengthened slightly, as if she was absorbing each sentence more fully before moving to the next. He initiated the conversation, Navarro said, when Maya finished the account of the ridge exchange. Not you. I had decided to maintain radio silence, Maya said. He spoke first. I responded because maintaining silence after he had confirmed awareness of my general position was no longer serving the concealment objective. And he asked why you were staying. He asked what I was holding for, Maya said, his exact phrasing. Yes. Holding for implies a transactional reason, a person, or an objective that is generating the behavior. What I was staying for is broader. His question assumed a specific answer. I think he already had a theory. Navarro looked at her. What theory? That the answer was the 6 people in the building, Maya said. He had already assessed the situation. He knew there were wounded personnel inside. He knew the tactical situation meant they couldn't move. He asked the question, I think, because he wanted to know whether I would answer honestly. And if you had lied? I don't think I would have, Maya said simply. Navarro made a note. The note he left, she said. You reading. 1 reading. Give it to me exactly. Maya closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. I have done this for 16 years. I have never sent a warning. You sent one. That is a different kind of soldier. The people in the building deserved better people. Today they had one. We will not be back to this valley. Navarro was quiet for a moment. You're certain of the exact wording? I read it twice, Maya said. The second reading was to confirm the first. Did you believe it? Which part? Navarro looked at her. The last sentence, Maya considered. I believed he meant it when he wrote it, she said. I also believe that his meaning it and his being able to honor it are 2 separate questions that depend on factors neither of us controlled when he wrote it. Such as? Who he answers to, Maya said. What they decide to do with a corridor that's been compromised. Navarro made another note. She looked at the tablet for a moment. She looked back at Maya. The messenger, she said. Darius, what's your read on him? Young, Maya said. Genuinely so, not performatively. He followed an instruction without understanding its full purpose. He's not a core operational element, he's peripheral. Someone brought in because the operation needed bodies, and he was available. Available how? That's a question for Darius, Maya said. but my read is circumstance rather than ideology. He doesn't have the specific certainty in his behavior that ideological commitment produces. He has the behavior of someone who ended up somewhere and doesn't fully know how, and he followed the instruction. Exactly, Maya said, which tells me the authority of the person who gave it is very significant to him. Not fear, he wasn't afraid when he sat down to wait. He was committed, there's a difference. He trusted him, Navarro said. Completely, Maya said. Navarro was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tablet. She made a decision about something. Maya could see it happening. And then she looked up and said, in a slightly different register, the register of someone who is about to say something they have not said in a formal debrief before Sergeant Carter. In your assessment, based on everything you observed and heard today, do you believe the senior element on that ridge made a decision this afternoon that went against his operational directive? The room was very quiet. The military member against the wall had not moved, but a quality of stillness had changed in the specific way of someone who has heard the question they were waiting to hear. Maya thought about the question carefully. She thought about the formation and the note and the messenger and the conversation in the dark. She thought about 16 years and a man who had never sent a warning and had, this afternoon, left 2 separate messages for the person who had sent one. Yes, she said. I believe he made at least one decision today that his operational directive did not include. Which decision? She looked at Navarro steadily, leaving instead of completing. Navarro held her eyes for a long moment. That's what we thought too, she said quietly. We just needed someone who was there to confirm it. 9:51 p.m. The debrief continued for another 20 minutes, covering the corridor theory, the formation configuration, the timing of events. Navarro was thorough and Maya was thorough, and at the end they sat in the specific quiet of 2 people who have fully mined a conversation and have nothing left to extract from it. You'll be transported to Flagstaff for medical assessment, Navarro said. We'll need you available for follow-up questions over the next 72 hours. Understood. Get some sleep. I've heard that several times today, Maya said. Has it worked yet? No. Navarro allowed a small, real expression to cross her face. Not a smile exactly, something adjacent to one. The shoulder should help, she said. Pain is a reliable sedative. That's the most military comfort I've received all day, Maya said. This time Navarro actually did almost smile. She stood, extended her hand again, and Maya shook it. Sergeant Carter, Navarro said. The 6 people from that building are all going to recover. I confirmed it before I arrived. Maya absorbed this. She had known they were stable. Stable and recovering were different words. All six, Navarro confirmed. She left the room. Maya sat at the table alone for a moment. The recorder was gone. The tablet was gone. The military observer had gone with Navarro. The room held only the table and the bench and the sound of Torres outside on the perimeter, and Ortega's low voice somewhere toward the north entrance. She put both hands flat on the table, the bandaged one and the good one, and she looked at them for a long time. All 6. She thought about Sergeant Miller and a 4-year-old daughter named Clara, whose father was going home. She thought about 5 other people she didn't know and would probably never meet, who were going home to whatever their versions of Clara were, the specific people and places and mornings. After that makes survival worth the effort of surviving. She thought about Darius against the north wall, with his hands on his knees and his careful English, and the trust he had placed in an instruction given by a man who had apparently, on this particular afternoon, decided that the instruction he was going to give was not the one the operation required. She thought about what that cost, not strategically. She would think about that in the rooms with better questions. She thought about what it cost, personally, the specific weight of choosing not to complete something that 16 years had built you to complete, the particular loneliness of a decision made in the dark that nobody on your side would understand. She thought she understood something about that. Not the same version of it. A different version, from a different direction. But the recognition of a decision that costs you something in the specific currency of your own certainty, that she understood. She took her hands off the table. She stood up. She walked out of the room, past the sleeping Darius, past the foil blanket and the empty water bottle, out through the east entrance into the cold desert air, and she stood there for a moment, looking north, where the corridor ran through the dark, carrying whatever it carried, where a man with 16 years and careful block letters had gone, after making a decision that the intelligence team was now going to spend considerable time and resources understanding. She thought, I don't know your name. I don't know if what you did today was the beginning of something or the end of it. But I know you sent a 21-year-old to sit in the dark with his hands visible because you needed me to know that you had made a choice. And the only reason to need someone to know you made a choice is if the choice cost you something. The desert was cold and quiet and very large. Somewhere in it, 2 vehicles were moving toward Flagstaff. Somewhere in it, 6 people were in hospital beds, present tense, recovering in the word's fullest meaning. And somewhere in it, on a route that wasn't on current maps, a man was walking north with a choice he had made this afternoon, carrying it the way you carry things that change the shape of who you are. She didn't know if it changed him for better or for worse. She didn't know if she would ever know. Torres appeared in the doorway behind her. "Transport is ready," he said. "Coming," she said. She looked north one more time. Then she turned and walked toward the light. The transport vehicle smelled like military equipment and cold coffee, and Maya sat in the back seat with her shoulder against the door and her injured hand in her lap and watched the desert move past the window without really seeing it. Torres was in the front passenger seat talking quietly into his radio in the compressed shorthand of someone filing interim reports. The driver was a young private named Ellison, who had not said a single word since they left the medical station, which Maya appreciated more than she could have articulated at this particular hour of this particular day. She was thinking about the debrief, specifically about the last question Navarro had asked, and about her own answer, and about what the answer meant in terms of what came next. She had told Navarro that the man on the ridge had made at least one decision that went against his operational directive. She had identified that decision as leaving instead of completing. And Navarro had said quietly that they had thought the same thing and needed someone who was there to confirm it. What Maya had not said in the debrief, because it was not the kind of thing you said in a formal intelligence debrief on insufficient sleep with a shoulder that was writing increasingly urgent letters of complaint, was what she thought decision meant at a human level, rather than an operational one. She thought about it now. A man who has done something for 16 years has built an identity around it. Not just a skill set, not just a professional practice, but an identity. The way he reads situations, the way he makes decisions, the way he understands his own value, all of it organized around the thing he has spent 16 years doing. When that man encounters a situation that causes him to act against the directive that the 16 years has built him toward, the question is not simply what changed his tactical calculation. The question is what cracked the identity. Because tactical calculations change all the time. They respond to information, to risk assessment, to resource availability. They are flexible by design. Identity is not flexible by design. Something had cracked it, and she was honest enough with herself, sitting in the dark transport vehicle on the way to Flagstaff, to acknowledge that she did not know whether that something was her specifically, or the 6 people in the building, or the 21-year-old he'd left behind as a message, or the accumulated weight of 16 years, finally reaching a threshold she couldn't see from the outside. She didn't know. She suspected she was never going to know exactly. And she sat with that the way she had learned to sit with all the things that didn't resolve into clean answers not comfortably, but honestly, without demanding from the uncertainty a clarity it wasn't able to provide. Torres's radio went quiet. He turned in the seat and looked at her. "You should sleep." "I know," she said. "Are you going to?" "Probably not yet." He turned back to face forward. Then, after a moment, without turning around, "The intelligence team found something else after you left." She straightened slightly. "What?" "The pack Darius was carrying when we found him. The one with the note. There was a secondary compartment in the bottom lining." He paused. "A phone, prepaid. One outgoing call in the log. Made it approximately 6:45 this evening." She processed the timeline. 6:45 was after he had left the ridge, after he had come back down and spoken to the remaining group and given Darius his instruction, after he had gone north. "He called someone," she said. "Yes. They're working on it," Torres said. "But the number traces to an area code in northern New Mexico. Not local to the valley," he reported in, she said. "That's the working assumption." And then he left the phone. "In the pack he instructed Darius to keep," Torres said. "In a concealed compartment that a cursory search would have found, but a basic field strip would not." She absorbed this. "He wanted us to find the phone." "Navarro thinks so." "Yes." She looked at the back of Torres's headrest. She thought about the note and the messenger, and now the phone. 3 separate messages left by a man who was not, by any definition of the word, a person who communicated casually. "He's telling us where to look," she said. Torres was quiet for a moment. "That's Navarro's read. What's yours?" "My read," Torres said slowly. Is that a man who has spent 16 years on one side of something and who made a decision today that went against everything that 16 years built, is not finished making decisions? He paused. He's choosing a direction, and he's leaving markers so the right people can follow the direction if they're paying attention. The transport was quiet except for the engine and the road and the occasional murmur of Torres's radio on low. He said, "We will not be back to this valley," Maya said. Yes, he didn't say where he would be instead. No, Torres agreed. He did not. She looked out the window at the dark moving past. The phone called to northern New Mexico, she said. That's the first, Mark said. It is. 10:41 p.m. She did sleep, finally, for approximately 40 minutes, the compressed, unrestful sleep of someone whose body has overridden their mind's objections by simply shutting down the argument. She woke when the transport slowed for Flagstaff Medical Facility entrance, and she came awake completely and immediately, the way she always did, no gradual surfacing, no transitional confusion, simply present and then more present. Her shoulder had settled from the persistent statement of fact into something quieter, a dull organized ache that she could manage without active attention, which Reyes had told her was a good sign, and which she took as a good sign without requiring additional confirmation. Torres was already out of the vehicle. She got out carefully, managing the sling, and stood in the cold facility parking area and looked up for a moment at the sky. Clear, fully dark, the specific density of stars visible at altitude without light pollution. She had a brief, involuntary thought about the 6 people who were somewhere inside this facility, or one like it, in beds, in the specific institution of recovery, and about the daughter named Clara whose father was going home. She walked inside. 11:08 p.m. The medical assessment took 40 minutes and confirmed what she had already known. The shoulder was a grade 2 separation with associated soft tissue damage that was going to require immobilization for 3 weeks and physical therapy for 2 months after that. The hand stitches were appropriate and the wound was clean. She had mild dehydration, and the specific metabolic depletion that followed extended high-intensity physical and cognitive demand, which the attending physician described in clinical terms, and Maya translated in her head as you ran your body very hard for 6 hours and it needs to refuel. She was assigned a bed in the facility's military ward and told that a formal medical follow-up would occur in the morning. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought about Sunday morning phone calls and daughters named Clara, and men with 16 years walking north into the dark with phones in concealed compartments, and she thought about all of it until the thinking became circular, and the circular became quiet. The quiet became the specific absence of thought. That is the last thing that happens before real sleep. She slept. For the first time since the afternoon that had changed everything about what she thought she knew about herself, she slept fully and without management. And in the morning, everything began again. 3 weeks later. The room had good lighting and bad coffee and 4 people around a table, which was a configuration Maya had now sat in 3 times in the 18 days since the valley, each session longer and more specific than the last, each one pulling another thread from the fabric of what had happened in the Arizona desert on and that had started as a routine recovery mission and ended as something considerably larger. Navarro was at the table. She was always at the table. She had a quality of permanence in these sessions that Maya had come to recognize as intentional. She was the continuous thread, the person who held the whole shape of the investigation in her head and used each session to add another specific detail to it. The other 3 people changed. Today there were 2 she hadn't seen before, and one she had, the silent military observer from the night of the debrief, who had a name now, Major Harlan. He was less silent today, which told her the shape of the investigation had reached a point where his role had changed from listener to participant. We identified the number, Navarro said, before Maya had fully settled into the chair. She looked at Navarro. The New Mexico number, yes. Navarro set the tablet on the table and turned it so Maya could see the screen. A name, a photograph, a brief dossier of the kind that had specific margins and specific fonts that Maya recognized as a particular category of official document. Do you recognize him? Maya looked at the photograph for a long time. No, she said. I've never seen him. We didn't think you would have, Navarro said. He's not a field element. He's organizational. The person who sits at the table where the directions come from. And he received a call from the man on the ridge at 6:45 on the day of the Valley engagement. A 7-minute call, Navarro said. We don't have the content, but we have the duration and the sequence. And the sequence tells us something. What does it tell you? It tells us that the man on the ridge called his organizational superior before he left the valley, Navarro said. Not after he was clear, not from a safe distance, but from the valley itself, within an hour of the engagement ending. She paused. That's not a standard extraction call. That's a report. Made in real time from the location of the failed operation to the person who authorized it. Maya sat with this. He was reporting a change, she said. We believe so, not a failure, a change. Navarro looked at her carefully. What's the distinction in your read? A failure report, Maya said slowly, is made after you're clear because the content of the report is about what went wrong and what it cost. You make it from safety because you need time and distance to frame it correctly. She paused. Real-time report from the location, made within the hour, is made while the information is still immediate. While you're still in the physical context of what happened. That's not framing a failure. That's reporting a decision. Major Harlan, who had been leaning forward slightly since she started talking, said he told his superior what he decided. Yes, Maya said. And he told him immediately, before going north, before the corridor, before anything that came after. She looked at Navarro. He was establishing the record, making sure the decision was documented with the person who needed to know about it in real time before any subsequent events could be interpreted as having caused the decision. The room was very quiet. He was protecting the decision, Navarro said. He was making it undeniable, Maya said. Whatever came after, the call established that the decision was made in the valley before any external pressure based on what he saw and chose. One of the people she hadn't met looked at Major Harlan. Harlan looked at Navarro. Navarro looked at Maya. Sergeant Carter, she said in the register of someone who has reached a point in a conversation that requires a specific kind of care. We need to talk about what we think happened to the man on the ridge after the call. Maya was very still. After the call, Navarro said, we believe his operational status changed. Not immediately. But the investigation has traced a series of events over the subsequent 2 weeks that are consistent with. She stopped, chose her next words carefully, with a significant internal response to a unilateral decision made without authorization. He made a choice they didn't sanction, Maya said. Yes, and they responded. We believe so. She was quiet for a long moment. Navarro held her eyes. We don't know, she said. We have evidence of his presence in 2 locations after the valley. After the second location, the evidence stops. The room absorbed the weight of that. Evidence stops doesn't mean he's gone, Major Harlan said carefully. No, Navarro agreed. It means we don't know. Maya looked at the table. She thought about the note in careful block letters. She thought about the 7-minute call to a man in New Mexico, whose photograph she was looking at on a government tablet. She thought about a 21-year-old, sitting with his hands on his knees, in the dark, doing exactly what he'd been told, trusting completely. She thought about 16 years. She thought about a decision made in a valley in Arizona on an afternoon in the desert. A decision that had cost something she still didn't have the full accounting of. He knew, she said quietly, when he made the call. He knew what reporting it immediately would cost him. We believe he understood the risk, Navarro said carefully. That's not what I mean, Maya said. She looked up. He knew, and he made the call anyway. Before he went north, before any of the subsequent events, he established the record and then he went. She paused. He made the decision clean. No one spoke for a moment. Then Navarro said very quietly, yes, that's what we think happened. The room held that. Outside, somewhere in the facility corridor, Maya could hear ordinary sounds, footsteps, a door, a voice asking a routine question. The sounds of the world continuing to function in its normal register, while this room sat with something that was not normal. That was the specific weight of a decision made by someone she didn't know and would probably never meet, that had begun with her sending a warning that nobody believed. She thought about what he had written. I have never sent a warning. You sent one. That is a different kind of soldier. She thought about what she understood now that she hadn't understood when she read it the first time. By flashlight in a medical station, 12 hours after an explosion and 14 opponents and a ridge held by one person for 6 hours. He had not been commenting on her tactics. He had been recognizing something in her that he had been looking for, without knowing he was looking for it, across 16 years of not finding it. She didn't know what to do with that. She thought she might spend a long time not knowing what to do with it. 6 weeks after the valley, she called her mother on Sunday morning at 9, same as always. Her mother asked about food and sleep. Maya told her the food had been manageable, and the sleep was improving, which was true. The shoulder was in the final week of the immobilization protocol, and the physical therapy was going better than the therapist had expected, which Maya attributed to having done the exercises exactly as prescribed, and which the therapist attributed to the same thing, while adding that most people didn't. You sound different, her mother said at the end of the call. Not accusatory, not worried or not more worried than her baseline. Simply observational, the way her mother was observational directly, without making the observation into a demand. Different how? A pause quieter, her mother said. But not sad quiet, the other kind. Maya thought about that for a moment. The other kind, she repeated. The kind that comes from something that happened that you're still carrying, her mother said. I know that kind, a beat. I've been watching you carry things your whole life. I know what the different kinds look like. Maya was quiet. You don't have to tell me, her mother said, gentle. Absolute. I just wanted you to know I can see it. I know you can, Maya said. You always could. Are you okay? She thought about the honest answer. She thought about the full honest answer and the partial honest answer, and the version of the answer fit into a Sunday morning phone call between a mother and a daughter who had learned to love each other across the gap that couldn't be closed. Yes, she said, I'm okay. And it was true. It was the complete version of true, the kind that doesn't require qualification. She was okay in the sense that mattered present, clear-eyed, carrying what she was carrying without being bent by the weight of it. Her mother seemed to hear all of this in the single word. Good, she said, simply as if that was everything. Maybe it was. 2 months after the valley, the ceremony was small, which was how Maya had requested it. Not because she was uncomfortable with recognition, she had made her peace with recognition as a fact of certain kinds of service. Something that happened to you, rather than something she sought. But because the event the recognition described had not been a thing she had done alone, and a large ceremony felt like a misrepresentation of the accounting. Torres was there, Reyes was there, Ortega was there. Major Harlan was in the back row in civilian clothes, which she appreciated. Navarro was not there, because Navarro's work was not the kind that appeared in ceremonies, and Navarro's presence would have implied a connection that it was not yet time to acknowledge officially. The 6 people from the medical station were not there, because their recoveries were still ongoing, because Sergeant Miller was still in rehabilitation for the leg, and because Maya had specifically requested, through Torres, that no contact be made with them for the purposes of this ceremony. They were recovering. Recovery was their work right now. She did not want to interrupt it to provide context for something they had been unconscious or unreachable for. They didn't need to be there. That was the whole point. The commendation language was formal and specific and covered what had happened on the ridge in the vocabulary that official documents use terms like sustained engagement and maintenance of position under extreme duress and protection of personnel unable to protect themselves. The language was accurate. It was also a translation of the afternoon into a format that official records required, which meant it was accurate the way translations are accurate, preserving the content while losing something essential about the original. She stood and listened to it and thought about the original. She thought about the broken radio held at a specific angle, with 3 fingers pressed against the cracked seam. She thought about 14 minutes to move 17 meters. She thought about the sound of laughter coming back through a radio in response to the words, I'm recon trained. She thought about the conversation in the dark with a man whose name she still did not know, and the note in careful block letters, and a 21-year-old with his hands on his knees. She thought about all of it, held it in the same place at the same time, and found that it held without contradiction. She had done what she had done. It had cost what it had cost. And the 6 people from the valley were alive. Everything else was commentary. When the ceremony was over, Torres came to stand beside her, while the other attendees dispersed toward the reception area. How are you, he said. Functional, she said. He made the sound. Carter. I'm good. I'm actually good. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has learned to read a specific person very well over a long period of time and is currently reading them carefully. I believe you, he said, which told her he had found what he was looking for. Any updates from Navarro, she said, not directly to me. But Harlan mentioned the New Mexico investigation is moving. He paused. And there's been movement in the corridor. Different pattern from before. More careful. He changed it, she said. Or someone changed it because he's no longer there to run it, Torres said. We don't know which yet. She nodded. She had learned to sit with that particular unknowing the gap between what had happened to a man who had walked north into the desert and what the evidence was able to confirm. She had learned to carry it the way her mother had described. The quieter kind, the kind that comes from something you're still holding. Navarro thinks it will resolve, Torres said. one way or another. The thread is long enough now that it goes somewhere. Good, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You know the commendation is going to bring attention. Questions from people above my level. You're going to be in more rooms. I know, she said. Are you ready for that? She thought about it honestly. She thought about what ready meant in this context, not the absence of uncertainty, not the presence of complete information, not the resolution of everything the valley had left unresolved. Ready in the only sense that it ever meant something to her. Present, clear, honest, and willing to do what the situation required. Yes, she said. Torres nodded once final complete. Then let's go get some of that bad coffee, he said, gesturing toward the reception area, and talk about something that has nothing to do with any of this. She almost smiled. What did you have in mind? My youngest one's soccer tournament is next weekend, he said. She scored twice in the last game. I have opinions. She did smile then. Small, real, the kind that arrives without effort. Tell me about it, she said. They walked toward the reception area together, and she listened to Torres talk about his daughter with the specific animation of a parent who has found something uncomplicated to be proud of. And she drank the bad coffee, and the afternoon was ordinary and unhurried, and she was present in it fully, which was its own kind of discipline. Sergeant Maya Carter did not walk away from the valley thinking she had won something. She walked away, knowing she had held something long enough for it to matter. There is a version of courage that announces itself, that stands up in the light and claims its name. And there is another version, quieter and harder and less photographable, that sits on a ridge in the fading desert light with a broken radio and a damaged shoulder and does the math and decides that the math comes out the same way every time you run it. You stay, because the 6 people in the building cannot, because someone has to be the person who stays, because the warning you send before you act is the thing you can live with afterward, regardless of whether anyone believed it. Maya Carter was not a person who needed to be remembered for what she did on that ridge. She was a person who needed to have done it, and she had. That was the whole accounting. That was the complete version. That was the thing she carried in the quiet way, the way her mother could see from 2.5 hours away on a Sunday morning at 9, the way Torres could read in the field-trained steadiness of her eyes when he looked carefully enough. Not glory, not legend, not the story that gets told in large rooms with good lighting and formal language. The simple, total, irreversible fact of 6 people breathing. And the soldier who made sure of it, whose last transmission of the afternoon on a broken radio held at a specific angle was 3 words. The area is clear. And it was